I need this job more than anything, Chloe whispered to herself as she clutched her resume with trembling hands. Standing before the massive iron gates of Arthur Foster's estate, she had no idea that bathing this cold-hearted millionaire would be just the beginning of a dangerous journey. With $17 left in her bank account and a 6-year-old son depending on her, this 19-year-old single mom was about to walk into a mansion filled with secrets, lies, and a powerful enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy her. What would you do if your last chance at survival meant facing someone who wanted you gone? What would you do if you had to choose between paying for electricity or putting food on your child's plate? For 19-year-old Chloe, this wasn't hypothetical. It was Tuesday. The refrigerator light flickered weakly as Chloe stared at the nearly empty shelves. 3 days until payday, and all that remained was half a loaf of stale bread and a small jar of peanut butter. The kitchen table was covered with bills instead of groceries. Electricity notice showing a final warning, rent already 2 weeks overdue, and a stack of medical bills from Lucas's asthma attack last month. Each envelope screamed urgency, but her empty bank account couldn't answer their demands. Chloe closed the refrigerator door and leaned against it, listening to the gentle breathing of her 6-year-old son, asleep in their shared bedroom. Lucas didn't know they had been surviving on the same groceries for over a week. He didn't know his mother had been skipping meals to make sure he could eat. He didn't understand why they suddenly needed to use candles at night, a game Chloe invented to make their electricity conservation seem like an adventure rather than a necessity. When she lost her job at the diner 3 months ago, Chloe had been optimistic. With her high school diploma and 2 years of customer service experience, finding another position seemed reasonable. But application after application disappeared into the void. Interviews led nowhere. The few callbacks offered wages so low she couldn't cover childcare costs. Each morning, she sent Lucas to school with a forced smile, promising things would get better soon. Each night, she clutched her pillow in the darkness, silently letting tears fall where her son couldn't see them. Pride had kept her from calling her estranged mother for help. Desperation was quickly eroding that barrier. She flipped through job listings for the 100th time that week, scrolling past positions requiring degrees she didn't have or experience she couldn't claim. Page after page of rejection before she'd even applied. Chloe's finger hovered over the screen, ready to close the browser, when an unusual listing caught her attention. Private caregiver needed for disabled gentleman. Live-in position. Excellent salary. Must be discreet, committed, and willing to sign confidentiality agreement. Prior experience helpful, but not required. Immediate start. The salary listed made her breath catch. It was 3 times what she'd made at the diner, enough to pay off their debts, build savings, and maybe even start a college fund for Lucas. Live-in meant no more rent payments, no more choosing between electricity and food. But the listing's vagueness made her uneasy. What exactly would caregiver entail? Why the emphasis on discretion and confidentiality? The lack of experience requirement seemed too good to be true. Nothing legitimate paid that well without qualifications. Chloe glanced at the small framed photo beside her. Lucas on his first day of kindergarten, gap-toothed smile beaming with possibility. He deserved so much better than this constant state of barely surviving. She thought about his upcoming birthday, how she'd promised him the action figure he'd been talking about for months. A promise she currently had no way to keep. Morning came too quickly. Chloe packed Lucas's lunch with the last of their bread, sending him off to school with a kiss and a reminder to take the bus directly to Mrs. Chen's apartment after school. Their elderly neighbor had been watching Lucas free of charge since Chloe lost her job, another debt she couldn't repay. In the harsh morning light, Chloe stared at the job listing again. Whatever this position entailed, whatever discretion meant, could it really be worse than watching her son go hungry? Could any job requirement be more difficult than explaining to a 6-year-old why they might have to move into their car next month? Her finger trembled as she tapped apply. The simplicity of the application surprised her. Basic contact information, a few questions about availability, and willingness to live on site. Within minutes of submitting, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Ms. Williams, this is regarding your application for the caregiver position. The woman's voice was crisp, professional. Mr. Foster would like to interview you today at 2 p.m. The position is urgent. Can you make yourself available? 2 hours later, Chloe stood at a bus stop, wearing her only decent outfit, black pants with a small coffee stain she'd tried to hide with a marker, and a button-up blouse she'd ironed using the hot water kettle as a makeshift steamer. Her resume, printed at the library for 25 cents a page, felt embarrassingly thin in her hands. The bus crawled through unfamiliar neighborhoods, each stop taking her farther from the cramped apartment and closer to a life she couldn't imagine. What kind of disabled person could afford to pay such a salary? What would they expect from her? The possibilities ranged from mundane to terrifying. As she stepped off at her stop, Chloe checked the address against the one she'd scribbled down. According to the map on her phone, the residence should be just ahead. She rounded the corner and froze. A massive iron gate stood before her, attached to a stone wall that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. Beyond it, partially visible through the ornate metalwork, stood what could only be described as a mansion, 3 stories, of imposing architecture with manicured grounds spreading around it, like a private park. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of money that existed in movies and magazines, not in the real world Chloe inhabited. For a moment, she considered turning back. People who lived like this wouldn't want someone like her in their home. But the thought of returning to that apartment, to those unpaid bills, to Lucas's hopeful face, asking if she'd found work yet, it propelled her forward. Her finger pressed the intercom button before she could change her mind. "Chloe Williams, for a 2 p.m. interview," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The gate swung open without a human response, the silent invitation more intimidating than any words could have been. The gravel driveway crunched beneath her worn shoes as she approached the house, each step taking her further from the life she knew and closer to something unknown. Whatever awaited her behind those massive doors couldn't possibly be as frightening as the future she and Lucas faced without this opportunity. With that thought firmly in mind, Chloe straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and climbed the steps to the entrance. Beyond this threshold lay either salvation or something she couldn't yet imagine. Either way, for Lucas, she would face it head-on. The massive doors swung open to reveal a world apart from Chloe's reality, but it wasn't the towering ceilings or priceless art that made her heart race. It was the silent figure in the wheelchair, watching her with eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she'd carefully constructed. The psychological weight of the mansion pressed down on her immediately. The architecture itself, a statement of power and privilege, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As she crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The marble floors echoed each tentative step, announcing her presence like an unwelcome intruder. This wasn't just wealth. It was wealth that had existed for generations, cultivated and protected, like the pristine gardens visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. For someone who had been counting pennies for bus fare just hours earlier, the contrast was jarring. "Ms. Foster will see you in the West Study," said a woman, who appeared suddenly at Chloe's side. "I'm Lucy, the head housekeeper." Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her manner efficient but not unkind. As she led Chloe through a maze of corridors, she lowered her voice. "I should warn you, Mr. Foster is quite demanding and direct. Don't take it personally. It's just his way since the accident." Chloe nodded, grateful for the heads up, but increasingly nervous. "What happened to him?" she ventured. Lucy's expression closed immediately. "That's not my place to discuss. Just remember, he values competence and honesty above all else, and he can spot a lie from a mile away." With that cryptic warning, she stopped before an ornate door and knocked twice before pushing it open. The study was a testament to refined taste. Leather-bound books lining dark wood shelves, original artwork adorning walls, and a massive desk positioned before windows overlooking the estate's grounds. But Chloe barely registered these details because her attention was immediately captured by the man positioned behind the desk. Arthur Foster was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that contrasted sharply with his wheelchair. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with sharp features and dark hair, showing the first hints of silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, keen, analytical, and utterly devoid of warmth. They assessed Chloe in seconds, taking in every detail, from her affordable but carefully chosen interview outfit to the slight tremble in her hands. "Chloe Winters," he stated, rather than asked. His voice was deep and clear, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sit. In those first 30 seconds, Chloe felt the full weight of first impressions. Research shows interviewers often form lasting judgments within moments of meeting a candidate, and Arthur Foster seemed to be making his assessment with clinical precision. Chloe moved to the chair opposite his desk, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the intimidation she felt. "Your resume is thin," he began, without preamble. "No college degree, no specialized training, no experience in healthcare or personal assistance." Each statement fell like a hammer. "Yet you applied for a position requiring discretion, dedication, and considerable skill in managing complex needs." Chloe opened her mouth to defend herself, but he raised a hand to silence her. "I'm not interested in excuses or rehearsed answers. I want to know one thing, and I expect complete honesty." He leaned forward slightly. "Why do you want this job?" The real reason. The question hung in the air between them. Chloe knew this moment would determine everything. She could fabricate a story about passion for caregiving or personal fulfillment, but something in those penetrating eyes told her it would be a fatal mistake. "For my son," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm a single mother, and I need to provide him with stability and a future. The truth is, I applied because the salary would change our lives." She met his gaze directly. "I don't have specialized training, but I'm a quick learner. I work harder than anyone I know, and I understand what it means to preserve someone's dignity even when they need help." Arthur's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered briefly in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he continued to study her. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes under his scrutiny, and Chloe resisted the urge to fill the silence with nervous chatter. "Most people," he finally said, "would have given me a story about wanting to help others or finding fulfillment in service. They rarely admit it's about the money." His fingers drummed once on the arm of his wheelchair. "Your honesty is unexpected." He wheeled himself around the desk, approaching until he was directly in front of her. Up close, Chloe could see the tenseness in his shoulders, the controlled strength in his upper body compensating for what had been lost below. "The position requires complete dedication," he continued. "You would live here 5 days a week, returning home for weekends. Your duties would include assisting with personal care, managing medication schedules, accompanying me to appointments, and various administrative tasks. The work is demanding and often thankless." Chloe nodded, processing what this would mean for her and Lucas. "My son, arrangements can be made for emergencies," he interrupted. "But this job must be your priority. During the work week." He studied her again, his gaze so intense that Chloe found herself wondering what he saw. Was he looking at her capabilities, her determination, or was he simply gauging whether she would crack under pressure? "The previous 5 candidates lasted less than 2 weeks, he added, almost as an afterthought. "They found the environment challenging." Chloe straightened her spine. "I've faced challenges my entire life, Mr. Foster. I'm still standing." For the briefest moment, something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "A poor choice of words, perhaps," he said, gesturing to his wheelchair. Chloe's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I apologize. I didn't mean—" "Stop." His command cut through her apology. "I have no interest in tiptoeing around my condition, and I won't tolerate those who do." He wheeled backward slightly, creating distance between them. "You'll be paid weekly. Lucy will show you to your quarters and explain the house rules." He turned away, dismissing her as he moved back behind his desk. "You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp." Chloe blinked in surprise. You're offering me the job? Just like that?" Arthur looked up, his expression once again unreadable. "Unless you've changed your mind." "No," Chloe said quickly. "I accept. Thank you for the opportunity." He nodded once, then fixed her with a final penetrating stare. "Don't disappoint me, Ms. Winters. Few get second chances in this house." As Lucy led her from the room, Chloe felt a storm of emotions. Relief that she had secured the position, anxiety about the demands ahead, and a strange sense that she had just agreed to something far more complicated than a caregiving role. The imposing architecture that had intimidated her upon arrival now felt like the least of her concerns. The housekeeper guided her through more corridors, explaining practical matters about meals, schedules, and protocol, but Chloe only half listened. Her mind was stuck on Arthur Foster, a man clearly used to wealth and power, now confined to a wheelchair, but no less intimidating for it. What had happened to him? And why did he inspire such caution in those around him? Your first duty begins at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning, Lucy informed Chloe, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper, assisting Mr. Foster with his bath. The words hung in the air like a sentence, and suddenly Chloe understood why the previous 5 caregivers hadn't lasted 2 weeks. This wasn't just about medication schedules or administrative tasks. This job required navigating the most intimate human vulnerabilities. That night, Chloe barely slept. Her mind raced with uncertainty. She'd taken care of her son since he was born, but bathing a grown man, a stranger, was entirely different. When morning came, she stood outside the master bathroom door, taking deep breaths to steady herself. The bathroom itself was a marvel of luxury and practicality intertwined. Marble floors stretched beneath a ceiling-mounted patient lift system. Chrome grab bars flanked a custom walk-in tub with a transfer seat. The shelves held expensive toiletries alongside medical-grade bathing products. Every detail spoke of someone who'd spared no expense adapting his environment while refusing to sacrifice quality. Lucy demonstrated the equipment with practiced efficiency. Mr. Foster prefers the water temperature at exactly 102 degrees. Always check it with the thermometer. These towels are arranged by size. The larger ones go here. He doesn't like to be asked unnecessary questions during the process. Just be professional. The underlying message was clear. Maintain his dignity at all costs. When Arthur entered the bathroom, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He wore a robe over pajama pants, his jaw set in determination. Without meeting Chloe's eyes, he positioned his wheelchair near the tub. "Let's get this over with," he said, voice tight with controlled emotion. Chloe noticed how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the safety rails. Scars crisscrossed the backs of his hands. Old, healed injuries that spoke of a violent past. Rather than asking questions, she focused on maintaining a calm, matter-of-fact demeanor. "I'll adjust the water temperature first," she said evenly. "Then we can begin whenever you're ready." Arthur removed his robe with difficulty, revealing more than just his physical condition. A jagged scar ran down his back, disappearing beneath the waistband of his pants, evidence of extensive surgery. Seeing Chloe's eyes flicker toward it, his expression hardened. "Don't treat me like an invalid," he snapped, when she moved to assist him with the transfer seat. "I know my limitations." Chloe stepped back, giving him space while remaining close enough to help if needed. "Of course, I'm here for whatever level of assistance you require." The silence during the bathing process was deafening. Arthur stared straight ahead, his body rigid with tension, as Chloe worked methodically, keeping her movements predictable and efficient. She made sure to maintain a respectful distance whenever possible, announcing each new step before proceeding. "I'm going to wash your back now," she would say, or "I'll rinse your hair next." These small courtesies seemed to soften his tension incrementally. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he realized she wasn't going to treat him with pity or discomfort. When the time came to wash his legs, Chloe noticed the muscle atrophy. Once powerful limbs, now significantly diminished. She kept her expression neutral, focusing on the task rather than the story the injuries told. Whatever had happened to Arthur Foster had been catastrophic, robbing him of more than just mobility. It had taken something from his spirit. The entire process took 40 minutes, during which Arthur spoke only to issue brief instructions. Yet as Chloe helped him dry off and into fresh clothes, she sensed his evaluating gaze. He was studying her, trying to decipher why she wasn't uncomfortable or awkward like the others had been. As she cleaned the bathroom afterward, organizing the soaps and hanging towels to dry, Arthur watched her from his wheelchair. "You seem to be handling this well," he finally said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a compliment, but rather an observation tinged with suspicion, as if her composure somehow made her less trustworthy. Chloe paused, considering her response. This felt like another test, perhaps the real one. Her instinct was to deflect with humor or downplay her competence, but something told her Arthur needed honesty more than comfort. "I've been through tougher things," she replied simply, meeting his gaze directly. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure you receive care that respects your dignity." Something shifted in Arthur's expression. Not quite warmth, but perhaps the first crack in his icy facade. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before wheeling himself toward the door. "Tomorrow, same time," he said, pausing at the threshold. "You can adjust the water temperature to 104 degrees. I prefer it warmer than Lucy thinks." It was a small disclosure, but Chloe recognized it for what it was, the first tentative step toward trust. As Arthur disappeared down the hallway, she felt the weight of what had just transpired. She hadn't just passed a test of professional competence. She'd begun the much more complex process of earning the trust of a man who'd built walls higher than his mansion's ceilings. Later that afternoon, as Chloe organized medication in Arthur's study, Lucy appeared with an expression of mild surprise. "He's requested you prepare his lunch today instead of the kitchen staff," she said, eyebrows raised. "That's unusual." Chloe nodded, understanding the significance. The bathroom, that most private space where vulnerability couldn't be hidden behind wealth or walls, had become the unlikely foundation for a professional relationship that might, with time and patience, evolve into something more human than either of them had anticipated. The scent announced her presence before she even appeared. It wasn't just expensive perfume. It was a statement, a territorial marking that floated through the mansion's corridors like an invisible warning. Chloe had just finished organizing the medical supplies when that distinctive fragrance grew stronger, followed by the soft click of designer heels against marble. The dining room door swung open with practiced elegance. The woman who entered moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never questioned their right to be anywhere. Her tailored dress probably cost more than Chloe's entire wardrobe, and her jewelry caught the light in deliberate flashes, like tactical weapons deployed to intimidate. "Arthur, darling," she purred, completely ignoring Chloe's presence. "I've been trying to reach you all morning." Arthur's jaw visibly tightened, a small but unmistakable reaction that spoke volumes. "Evelyn, this is unexpected." Only then did the woman turn, as if just noticing Chloe standing there. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating as they assessed every detail of Chloe's appearance. "So this is the new girl?" Evelyn's gaze swept over Chloe with the clinical precision of someone appraising furniture. "She looks rather fragile for the job requirements, doesn't she?" The word fragile hung in the air like a weapon. Chloe recognized it immediately for what it was, the opening salvo in what would clearly be an ongoing battle. "Chloe is perfectly capable," Arthur replied, his tone clipped. "Lucy has already brought her up to speed on her responsibilities." Evelyn circled the table, trailing her manicured fingers along the polished surface as she approached. Of course. I'm simply concerned about your welfare, Arthur. These caregiver positions can be so demanding. I'd hate to see another one leave, just when you've gotten comfortable." Her words carried a double edge that wasn't lost on Chloe. Not only was she implying Chloe couldn't handle the job, but she was also making it clear that replacements happened frequently, a thinly veiled threat about job security. "I believe I can manage just fine," Chloe said, meeting Evelyn's gaze directly. "Mr. Foster's care is my priority." Evelyn's smile tightened fractionally. "How admirable. And how long have you worked in private care exactly?" Before Chloe could answer, Evelyn had already turned back to Arthur, effectively dismissing her. "Arthur, we need to discuss the Foundation's upcoming benefit. The board has questions about your attendance." The power play was unmistakable. By addressing only Arthur and speaking about matters Chloe wasn't privy to, Evelyn was marking her territory and establishing a hierarchy where Chloe was clearly at the bottom. "We can discuss it later," Arthur replied, his voice carrying a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "I have schedules to review with Chloe." "Surely your assistant can wait while we handle actual business," Evelyn countered, the slight pause before assistant, injecting the word with dismissive undertones. Chloe observed the dynamic carefully. Arthur's discomfort was evident in the whitening of his knuckles on the wheelchair's armrests. But there was something else, a reluctance to directly challenge Evelyn that suggested their relationship was complicated by factors beyond simple business. "Perhaps I should step out while you discuss private matters," Chloe offered, maintaining her professional composure. "No," Arthur said firmly. "We'll continue as planned." "Evelyn, We can speak tomorrow. Evelyn's face transformed with practiced skill, disappointment replacing the cold calculation. If you insist, darling. Though I worry about you pushing yourself too hard. Her gaze flickered to Chloe. Not everyone understands your special needs the way I do. The statement was loaded with insinuation, suggesting an intimacy with Arthur's condition that Chloe couldn't possibly match. It was a clever tactic, establishing herself as irreplaceable while simultaneously undermining Chloe's role. As lunch progressed, Evelyn continued her subtle offensive. She peppered the conversation with references to past events and shared experiences that excluded Chloe, creating an invisible wall between them. Each comment was crafted with surgical precision, designed to make Chloe feel like an outsider while maintaining a veneer of polite conversation. Remember that awful doctor in Switzerland, Arthur? The one who insisted on those ridiculous exercises? Evelyn laughed lightly. Thank goodness I was there to intervene. Chloe noticed how Evelyn positioned herself as Arthur's protector, the indispensable guardian against a world that didn't understand him. It was manipulation, masked as concern, and from Arthur's tight expression, the tactic wasn't new. When Evelyn accidentally knocked over Chloe's water glass, her apology came with a patronizing smile. Oh dear, how clumsy of me. You must be so overwhelmed with all your new responsibilities. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? The incident wasn't random. It was calculated to fluster Chloe, to make her appear incompetent as she scrambled to clean up the spill. But Chloe had weathered far worse storms than an entitled woman's psychological warfare. She calmly blotted the tablecloth with her napkin, her movements unhurried and controlled. No harm done, Chloe replied with a measured smile. Accidents happen to everyone. Something flickered across Evelyn's face. Surprise, perhaps, that her target hadn't reacted as expected. Her tactics shifted immediately, becoming more direct. Arthur tells me you have a child. The question came with feigned interest. How difficult that must be, balancing motherhood with such demanding work. The hours here can be so unpredictable. The implication was clear. How could Chloe possibly be a good mother while working here? It was a calculated strike, aimed at Chloe's most vulnerable point. My son understands the importance of responsibility, Chloe answered simply. We both do. Arthur watched this exchange with growing tension, his eyes moving between the two women. Whatever his relationship with Evelyn, he seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior. I think that's enough for today, he finally interjected. Chloe and I have a schedule to maintain. Evelyn's departure was as dramatic as her entrance. A flurry of air kisses, lingering touches on Arthur's shoulder, and one final, evaluating glance at Chloe that carried a clear message. This isn't over. As the expensive perfume slowly dissipated from the room, Chloe felt the atmosphere lighten. Arthur exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath. Evelyn can be intense, he offered, the closest thing to an apology Chloe had heard from him. I understand, Chloe replied, though she was beginning to realize that understanding the complex dynamics of this household would take more than professional training. This was personal territory, lined with emotional landmines. Later that evening, after finishing her duties, Chloe retreated to her room for her nightly call with Lucas. The sound of her son's voice through the phone was like stepping into another world, one without power, struggles, and psychological warfare. Is your new job fun, Mommy? Lucas asked, his innocent question highlighting the stark contrast between her two worlds. It's interesting, Chloe replied carefully. I'm helping a man who needs special care, like when I was sick and you took care of me. Something like that, Chloe said, smiling despite herself. But he's a grown-up, so it's different. Is he nice? The question gave Chloe pause. Was Arthur nice? He was complicated, guarded, damaged in ways she was only beginning to understand. And now, there was Evelyn, a new variable in an already complex equation. Behind every cold exterior lies a story, and Arthur's was hidden in plain sight. As Chloe pondered the complicated man in her care, she couldn't have known that the answer was literally gathering dust in his bedroom closet. The photo album she'd discover would show a different Arthur entirely, standing tall, surrounded by friends, with a smile that could light up a room, and his reaction to being caught looking at it would be the first crack in the fortress he'd built around himself. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon while Chloe was organizing Arthur's bedroom closet. The task seemed simple enough. Arrange his clothes by season and color, a request that Arthur had made with his usual detached precision. As she reached for the upper shelf, her fingers brushed against something tucked away in the corner, a leather-bound album, its surface layered with dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of her. She carefully pulled it down, wiping away the gray film with her sleeve. The weight of it felt significant in her hands. Should she open it? This was clearly something personal, something Arthur had deliberately hidden away, but something compelled her to look inside. A sense that understanding this man required more than just attending to his physical needs. The first page revealed a younger Arthur, perhaps in his early 30s. He stood tall beside a sailboat, the wind tousling his hair, his smile wide and genuine. It was jarring to see him like this, not just standing, but radiating a joy that seemed completely foreign to the bitter man she'd come to know. She turned the page and found more glimpses of a life she couldn't reconcile with her employer's current existence. Arthur, hiking on a mountain trail. Arthur surrounded by friends at what looked like a charity gala. Arthur, with his arm around an older woman who shared his eyes, his mother perhaps. "What are you doing?" The voice startled her so badly she nearly dropped the album. Arthur had wheeled into the room silently, his face unreadable as he observed her intrusion into his past. "I'm sorry," Chloe said quickly, closing the album and moving to return it. "I was organizing the closet and found this. I shouldn't have—" "No," Arthur said, surprising her. His voice wasn't angry, but distant, almost hollow. "You might as well look. It's a life that no longer exists." He wheeled closer, and Chloe hesitantly reopened the album, aware of Arthur watching over her shoulder. She turned to a page, showing him on a stage, receiving some kind of award, beaming with pride. "Corporate Innovation Award," Arthur said quietly. "I used to design sustainable housing solutions, buildings that would last centuries, while leaving minimal environmental footprints." His finger hovered over the photo, but didn't touch it, as if afraid the image might dissolve. "I was going to change the world." Chloe nodded, suddenly understanding more about the man beside her. "You must miss it. Happiness is overrated," Arthur replied, his voice hardening again. "What matters is control, and that's what was taken from me. Not just my legs, but my ability to determine my own path." Chloe turned another page to find a photo of Arthur standing at the edge of a cliff, arms outstretched, as if embracing the horizon. Something about the freedom in that pose made her heart ache for what he'd lost. "I don't think you've lost control entirely," she said carefully, aware she was venturing into dangerous territory. "You still get to choose how you face things." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap at her as she expected. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Is that what you tell yourself?" he asked. "When you're struggling to feed your son or pay your bills? That you still have control?" The question wasn't cruel, just searching, as if he genuinely wanted to understand her perspective. "Yes," Chloe answered honestly, "because otherwise, what's the point? I can't control what happens to me, but I can control how I respond to it." Arthur didn't reply, but his eyes lingered on a photo of himself, surrounded by what appeared to be colleagues, all raising glasses in celebration. She could see how these images represented more than just memories. They were pieces of an identity he was grieving, a version of himself that existed before trauma redefined his life. "It must be difficult," she said softly, "reconciling who you were with who you are now." The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far, crossed a line that would trigger his anger. Instead, Arthur's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a slight softening around the eyes, a barely noticeable release of tension in his shoulders. "It's not about reconciliation," he finally said. "It's about acceptance. Accepting that the past is irretrievable." He gestured toward his wheelchair. "This is my reality now. Looking back only sharpens the contrast." And yet, Chloe noticed, he hadn't ordered her to put the album away. In fact, he seemed reluctantly drawn to it, like someone revisiting the scene of a painful loss, searching for closure. "Maybe," Chloe ventured, "the past doesn't have to be completely irretrievable. Not the physical abilities, perhaps, but the parts of you that made those moments meaningful." Arthur's eyes narrowed. What parts would those be? The person who could smile like that, she said, pointing to a particularly joyful image. The person who inspired others, the person who had dreams big enough to change the world. A flicker of something, vulnerability perhaps, crossed Arthur's face before disappearing behind his usual mask. But that brief glimpse was enough for Chloe to sense a shift, like the first hairline crack in a dam. "You should finish organizing the closet," Arthur said finally, wheeling back slightly, "and put the album wherever you found it." But as he turned to leave, he paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he added, the words so quiet she almost missed them. "For what?" "For not pitying me when you saw those pictures. Most people do." With that, he left the room, leaving Chloe standing there with the album in her hands, aware that something fundamental had changed between them. She carefully returned the album to its place on the shelf, but positioned it where it would be easier to reach, just in case Arthur ever wanted to look at it again. As relationships inside the mansion subtly shifted, something sinister was brewing just beneath the surface. The morning after Chloe had seen Arthur's album, she found an unexpected envelope propped against her water glass at breakfast. No postmark, no signature, just 5 chilling words scrawled in elegant handwriting. "Watch your step. You don't belong." The note trembled slightly in Chloe's fingers as she stared at it, her appetite vanishing instantly. This wasn't a casual warning. This was a calculated threat, designed to make her feel unsafe in a place where she needed to work. For Lucas. Always for Lucas. When Lucy entered with fresh coffee, she noticed Chloe's pallor immediately. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, setting down the carafe. When Chloe silently handed over the note, Lucy's face darkened with concern, but not surprise. "I was afraid something like this might happen," Lucy murmured, carefully folding the note and returning it. "There are a lot of people here who don't like change, and you've been changing things since you arrived." "Changing what exactly?" Chloe asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Lucy's eyes darted toward the doorway before she leaned closer. "Mr. Foster's routine, his mood, the way he's starting to engage again. Some people preferred him, manageable." The implication hung in the air between them. "You mean Evelyn?" Chloe said flatly. Lucy straightened quickly. "I didn't say that. I can't say that." But her expression said everything her words couldn't. Over the next few days, Chloe found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. The mansion, already imposing, now felt like a labyrinth of potential dangers. Was someone watching her from behind the heavy drapes? Were footsteps following her down the corridor only to disappear when she turned around? The psychological weight of intimidation began to take its toll, exactly as the note writer had intended. On Thursday morning, Chloe was preparing Arthur's medication when Evelyn materialized in the doorway of the medical room, her presence announced only by the now familiar scent of her expensive perfume. "Arthur seems quite taken with you," Evelyn remarked, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold, as she examined her manicure. "It's charming, really. He's always had a soft spot for strays." Chloe carefully measured the dosage, refusing to be baited. "Mr. Foster appreciates professionalism and honesty. I'm just doing my job." "Yes, your job." Evelyn's smile sharpened. "I should remind you that you can be replaced at any moment. Jobs like yours are," she paused deliberately, "disposable." The threat wasn't even veiled anymore. But Chloe maintained her composure, thinking of the research she'd once read about workplace intimidation. The tactic was textbook. Establish superiority, remind the target of their precarious position, create anxiety about their future. Knowledge was power, and recognizing the manipulation helped Chloe stand firm. "Is there something specific about my performance that concerns you, Ms. Evelyn?" Chloe asked, her voice neutral as she recorded the medication in Arthur's log. Something flashed in Evelyn's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at not achieving the intimidation she'd expected. She straightened her already perfect posture. "Just remember your place, dear. You're the help, not family." As Evelyn clicked away down the hallway on her designer heels, Chloe released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation confirmed her suspicions, but proof remained elusive. The threats escalated the following week. A second note appeared, tucked between the pages of Arthur's therapy schedule. "Leave before it's too late." Then a third, slipped under her bedroom door at night. "Your presence is becoming a problem." Each message increased the psychological pressure. Research showed that this kind of persistent intimidation could lead to debilitating anxiety, making the target feel perpetually unsafe. Chloe found herself unable to sleep properly, jolting awake at the slightest sound. During her weekend visits home, she hugged Lucas tighter than usual, drawing strength from his innocent affection. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked during Sunday breakfast, his perceptive eyes catching something in her expression that she thought she'd hidden. "Of course, buddy," she assured him, ruffling his hair. "Just thinking about work stuff." "Is the grumpy man in the wheelchair being mean to you?" Lucas asked, with the directness only children possess. Chloe smiled, despite herself. "No, actually, Mr. Foster is complicated, but he's not the problem." "Then what is the problem?" The simple question pierced through her growing fear. What was the problem? Someone was trying to intimidate her. Someone wanted her gone. But why? If it was just Evelyn's dislike, why go to such elaborate lengths? By Monday morning, Chloe had made a decision. During her private time with Arthur during his therapy exercises, she carefully broached the subject. "I've been receiving some concerning messages," she said, helping him stretch his arm, as instructed by the physiotherapist. Arthur's eyes sharpened immediately. "What kind of messages?" When Chloe described the notes, Arthur's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing visibly along his temple. "How long has this been happening?" "About 2 weeks now." His voice lowered dangerously. "And you're just telling me now?" "I didn't want to burden you with staff issues," Chloe explained. "And honestly, I wasn't sure what to make of it at first." Arthur stared at her with an intensity that made her wonder if she'd made a mistake in telling him. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Are you planning to leave?" The question caught her off guard. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not easily intimidated." A look of respect flickered across his features. "Good. I'll have security investigate this immediately." "That's not necessary," Chloe started to say, but Arthur cut her off. "It is. No one threatens people in my household." The fierce protectiveness in his voice revealed yet another layer to the complex man she was coming to know. Later that afternoon, Evelyn cornered Chloe in the library. Her usual composure seemed fractured, a hint of desperation leaking through. "I hear you've been complaining to Arthur about feeling unwelcome," she said accusingly. "I mentioned some anonymous threats I've received," Chloe corrected her. "Should I assume you know something about them?" Evelyn's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, little girl. Arthur may find you amusing now, but I've been in his life for years. I know what's best for him." "Do you?" Chloe challenged quietly. "Because from what I've seen, what's best for him isn't isolation and dependency." "You know nothing about him or his needs," Evelyn hissed. "You're a temporary distraction, a novelty that will wear off." As Evelyn stormed away, Chloe didn't feel the fear she'd expected. Instead, a clarity began to emerge. This wasn't just about personal dislike or professional territory. Evelyn's reaction was too extreme, too desperate. That evening, while organizing Arthur's correspondence, Chloe noticed a pattern in the business documents requiring his signature. Many involved substantial transfers to consulting firms with vague deliverables. Others authorized discretionary spending accounts with minimal oversight. All had been presented by Evelyn. While financial knowledge wasn't Chloe's expertise, even she could recognize that someone with access to Arthur's accounts could potentially divert funds if he remained disengaged and dependent. Someone who wanted to maintain control over his fortune would see Chloe's influence as a threat, especially if Arthur was becoming more alert and involved due to her care. A final note appeared on her pillow that night. "This is your last warning. Leave now." But instead of fear, Chloe felt determination harden within her. The stakes were becoming clear. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about Arthur's well-being and possibly his fortune. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the mansion grounds as Chloe stood at Arthur's bedroom window, drawing back the heavy curtains that had remained closed for far too long. The sprawling garden below, once meticulously maintained, but now showing signs of neglect, caught her attention. Between the threatening notes and Evelyn's hostility, Chloe needed to find a new approach to break through Arthur's walls. Nature itself might just be the ally she needed. "I think we should go outside today," Chloe suggested, her voice casual yet determined. She wheeled Arthur's breakfast tray aside, deliberately avoiding his immediate reaction. Arthur's eyebrows furrowed instantly. "Outside? What for?" His tone carried the practiced resistance of someone who had grown comfortable in confinement. "The garden looks beautiful, even from up here," Chloe replied, gesturing toward the window. "And honestly, after being cooped up in this mansion for weeks, I could use some fresh air myself. I haven't been in that garden in nearly 3 years," Arthur stated flatly, as if this fact alone should end the conversation. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. Chloe nodded, acknowledging his resistance without accepting defeat. "That's exactly why today's the perfect day to change that." She moved behind his wheelchair before he could formulate another objection. 20 minutes, that's all I'm asking. If you hate it, we'll come right back in." The journey through the mansion's corridors felt like a small victory itself. With each yard closer to the garden doors, Arthur's breathing grew more labored, not from physical exertion, but from mounting anxiety. When they finally reached the French doors leading to the terrace, Arthur stiffened. "Stop." His command came sharp and sudden. "This is ridiculous. I don't need to subject myself to this spectacle." Chloe moved around to face him. "What spectacle? There's no one out there but the birds and butterflies." She knelt to eye level with him. "Arthur, spending just 20 minutes in a garden setting can dramatically reduce stress hormones in your bloodstream. That's not my opinion. That's science. Don't patronize me with wellness statistics," Arthur snapped, but there was less conviction in his voice. "I'm not asking you to run a marathon or host a garden party," Chloe said softly. "Just feel the sun on your face. That's all." Something in her tone, perhaps the absence of pity, seemed to reach him. After a moment of tense silence, Arthur gave a curt nod. 20 minutes, not a second more. The garden welcomed them with a symphony of subtle sounds. Rustling leaves, distant birdsong, the soft bubbling of a neglected fountain that somehow still functioned. As Chloe wheeled Arthur down the stone path, his posture remained rigid, his eyes darting suspiciously, as if expecting to be ambushed by memories at every turn. "The roses need pruning," he muttered, his first words since entering the garden, "and those hydrangeas are completely overgrown." Chloe smiled, recognizing criticism as Arthur's way of engaging. "So, you know your plants." "I designed this entire space," Arthur said, his voice softening imperceptibly. "Every pathway, every plant grouping. The soil here is—" He trailed off, perhaps surprised by his own enthusiasm. They reached a small clearing with a bench overlooking a koi pond. The fish, orange and white flashes beneath the surface, seemed to dance with recognition as Arthur's shadow fell across the water. "They remember you," Chloe observed, watching the fish cluster near where Arthur's wheelchair rested. "Impossible. Fish have a 3-second memory," Arthur countered, but he leaned forward slightly, studying the creatures with unexpected interest. "That's actually a myth," Chloe said. "Studies show fish can remember feeding routines and recognize their caretakers for months, even years." As the minutes passed, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The tension in Arthur's shoulders began to ease, his breathing deepened, the permanent crease between his eyebrows softened. When a butterfly landed briefly on his armrest, Arthur didn't flinch away. He observed it with quiet fascination until it fluttered off. "I used to come here every morning," Arthur finally said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Coffee at sunrise. It was—" He swallowed hard, searching for the right word. "Necessary for my sanity." Chloe sat on the edge of the bench nearest his chair, careful not to disrupt the delicate moment. "What stopped you?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "After the accident, everything changed. I couldn't bear to see this place and remember who I was, what I could do before." His voice carried the weight of years of self-imposed isolation. "The garden hasn't changed," Chloe observed gently. "It's still here, waiting for you." "I'm not the same man who designed it," Arthur replied, bitterness edging back into his voice. "No, you're not," Chloe agreed, surprising him with her candor. "But that doesn't mean you can't find new ways to connect with what once brought you peace." Arthur's gaze drifted to a nearby stone planter filled with herbs. "I used to cook with those," he said quietly. "Rosemary, thyme, fresh basil for pasta dishes." "Nothing stopping you from cooking again," Chloe suggested. "Your hands are perfectly capable." "That's not the point," Arthur said sharply, but then his voice softened. "It's not just about what I can physically do. It's about—" He struggled for words. "Revisiting meaningful places can evoke positive memories and emotions," Chloe said, remembering something she'd read about trauma recovery. "It's part of the healing process." especially after loss. Arthur's eyes met hers, surprised by her insight. Where did you learn that? I thought you had no healthcare training. I don't, Chloe admitted, but I've done a lot of reading since I started working here. About recovery, about trauma. I wanted to understand. She hesitated. I wanted to understand you better. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. For once, Arthur didn't respond with sarcasm or dismissal. Instead, he turned his attention back to the garden, studying the dappled sunlight playing through the leaves of a Japanese maple. There used to be a bench over there, he said, pointing to a spot near a small creek that ran through the property. I'd sit for hours sketching building designs. Some of my best work happened not at a desk, but right there. We could have another bench installed, Chloe suggested. The environment plays a crucial role in mental health recovery. Natural settings promote relaxation and reduce anxiety. Arthur's hand, which had been gripping the armrest tightly, gradually relaxed. You're quite persistent, Ms. Winters. Chloe, she corrected gently. And yes, I am, especially when I believe in something. And you believe in what exactly? My miraculous recovery? Some fairy tale transformation where I suddenly leap from this chair and dance through the garden? His words were bitter, but his tone lacked the usual edge. I believe in creating supportive environments that allow people to heal at their own pace, Chloe said simply. No pushing, no unrealistic expectations, just possibilities. The 20 minutes Chloe had negotiated stretched to 30, then 40. Arthur pointed out various features of the garden, the placement of specific plants for texture and color, the carefully planned sight lines that revealed new beauty from each vantage point. His knowledge was impressive, his passion unmistakable. When a light breeze rustled through the trees, Arthur closed his eyes and tilted his face toward it, a gesture so natural, yet so profound, that Chloe had to look away to hide her emotion. This small movement represented a breakthrough more significant than any physical therapy session could achieve. As they finally turned back toward the house, Arthur's hand moved to the wheels of his chair. I can manage this part, he said, quietly, propelling himself forward with newfound determination. Chloe walked alongside, not helping, but ready if needed. The perfect metaphor for their evolving relationship. Arthur's hands rested loosely on the wheels now, no longer gripping them with white-knuckled tension. His posture remained straighter, his breathing easier. He hadn't smiled, hadn't made grand declarations of change, but something fundamental had shifted. The garden had awakened something in Arthur that medication and traditional therapy hadn't reached. A connection to his former self that didn't require him to deny his present reality. It was, in its quiet way, revolutionary. That revolutionary spark Arthur found in the garden was about to be fanned into flame by the most unexpected visitor, a small boy with a crayon drawing who would shatter barriers that had stood firm against therapists, doctors, and even Chloe herself. The garden had awakened something in Arthur, but it would take the disarming honesty of a child to truly break through the walls he had built around himself. The sound of small, hurried footsteps echoed through the mansion's marble hallway, completely out of place among the usual measured paces of staff. Chloe turned from where she was organizing Arthur's medication to see Lucas racing toward her, his backpack bouncing wildly against his small frame, a rolled-up piece of paper clutched tightly in his fist. Lucas? Chloe whispered in shock, her eyes darting nervously toward Arthur's study. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at after-school care. Ms. Jenny had to close early, Lucas explained breathlessly, his eyes wide with excitement. Uncle Mike dropped me off. He said it was okay since you work here now. He thrust the paper forward. Look what I made for your new friend. Chloe felt her stomach drop. This violated every professional boundary she'd been careful to maintain. Honey, I'm working right now. Mr. Foster is very busy but it was too late. Arthur's wheelchair appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the small visitor. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, marched directly up to Arthur with the confidence only a child could muster. Are you the man in the chair? He asked, looking up at Arthur without a trace of the hesitation or pity adults typically showed. Chloe stepped forward, mortified. Lucas, that's not— Yes, Arthur interrupted, his voice softer than Chloe had ever heard it. I am the man in the chair. Lucas nodded, as if confirming something important. "I made this for you." He unfurled the paper to reveal a colorful crayon drawing, a garden with vibrant flowers, a blue sky, and two figures, one standing and one sitting, in what was unmistakably a wheelchair. Chloe moved to intervene, certain that Arthur would be offended by this innocent but potentially sensitive depiction. "Lucas, Mr. Foster is very busy. We should let him stay," Arthur said, his eyes not leaving the drawing. He extended his hand for the artwork, examining it with a scrutiny usually reserved for architectural blueprints. "You've captured the garden remarkably well. Do you like to draw?" Lucas beamed, bouncing slightly on his toes. "I love drawing. Ms. Jenny says I have imagination. That means I can see things other people can't." "Imagination," Arthur corrected gently, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "And your teacher is right." Chloe watched in astonishment as Arthur wheeled himself backward, creating space. "Would you like to see where I keep my own drawing supplies?" he asked Lucas. Lucas's eyes widened. "You draw too?" "I used to design buildings," Arthur explained, leading them toward his study. "Different from your artwork, but similar in some ways." Chloe followed behind, witnessing something she couldn't have imagined. Arthur opened a drawer in his desk that she'd never seen him access before, pulling out a leather portfolio. With careful movements, he spread architectural sketches across the surface, intricate designs, rendered with precision. Lucas studied them with surprising intensity. "These are buildings that could withstand earthquakes while using minimal resources," Arthur explained, his tone lacking its usual edge. "They exist now, in different cities around the world." "Cool," Lucas exclaimed, tracing his finger respectfully above the lines. "Can you teach me to draw buildings?" Arthur's face softened further. "Perhaps, but your style," he gestured to Lucas's crayon drawing, "has something my technical drawings lack, something many people lose as they grow older." "What's that?" Lucas asked. "Freedom," Arthur replied simply. "The ability to see the world as it could be, not just as it is." He turned to Chloe, who stood frozen in the doorway. "You should have brought him sooner." For the next hour, Chloe watched as Arthur showed Lucas different drawing techniques, explaining concepts of perspective and balance in words a child could understand. Lucas soaked it all in, asking questions that would have seemed impertinent from anyone else, about Arthur's wheelchair, about why he lived in such a big house alone, about whether he was happy. And Arthur answered each one, not with the measured responses he gave adults, but with a directness that mirrored Lucas's own. When Lucas asked why Arthur couldn't walk, he simply said, "My legs don't work properly anymore, but my mind still does." When Lucas suggested that Arthur could build a ramp in the garden so he could go there more easily, Arthur didn't dismiss the idea as simplistic. He actually reached for a notepad and began sketching potential designs, asking for Lucas's input. The transformation was remarkable. Arthur's shoulders relaxed, his voice lost its clipped tone, and most astonishingly, he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Not the tight, polite expression he used with business associates or the sardonic twist of his lips when making a cutting remark, but a genuine expression of joy. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Arthur asked, pressing the intercom to request 2 servings without waiting for an answer. When Lucas enthusiastically nodded, Arthur added, "Make that 3, with a glance toward Chloe. As they sat together, Lucas happily swinging his legs from an antique chair worth more than Chloe's entire apartment. Arthur watched him with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Children see differently," Arthur said quietly to Chloe, his eyes still on Lucas. "No preconceptions, no social barriers. He asked me about my wheelchair within seconds of meeting me, something most adults dance around for weeks." "I'm so sorry about that," Chloe started, but Arthur waved her apology away. "Don't be. It's refreshing. He doesn't see me as damaged or as an object of pity. I'm just the man in the chair who can teach him to draw buildings." The peaceful moment was shattered by the sharp click of heels on marble. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her expression darkening as she took in the scene. "What is this?" she demanded, her eyes fixing on Lucas's drawing that now held a place of honor on Arthur's desk. "Arthur, you know your doctors advised against unnecessary excitement or disruptions to your routine." Before Chloe could apologize or explain, Arthur spoke. "Lucas is hardly a disruption, Evelyn. In fact, his visit has been the highlight of my week. Evelyn's perfectly arched eyebrow rose higher. A child? In your private study? With your valuable designs? She reached for Lucas's drawing. And what is this supposed to be? Arthur's hand shot out, faster than Chloe had ever seen him move, stopping Evelyn's perfectly manicured fingers an inch from the crayon artwork. That is a gift from a talented young artist. I'd appreciate if you didn't touch it. The tension in the room thickened. Lucas, sensing the change in atmosphere, moved closer to Chloe. Perhaps we should continue this discussion later, Evelyn suggested icily. When you're alone. Perhaps we shouldn't continue it at all, Arthur countered. He turned to Lucas with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the steel in his voice, moments before. Thank you for visiting today. Would it be all right if I kept your drawing? I'd like to have it framed. Lucas nodded enthusiastically. Can I come again and make more? Of course, Arthur said without hesitation, ignoring Evelyn's sharp intake of breath. In fact, I insist on it. As Chloe gathered Lucas's things to take him home for the evening, Arthur caught her eye. Children have a way of breaking through barriers adults can't even see, he said quietly. Their creative expression allows them to communicate what they feel without the filters we impose on ourselves. It's something I'd forgotten. The freedom Arthur rediscovered through Lucas's visit was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. As he stared at the financial statements spread across his desk, the numbers told a story more chilling than any physical limitation. Someone had been quietly erasing his fortune while pretending to safeguard it. The real prison wasn't his wheelchair. It was the web of lies spun by the one person he thought he could trust. These diversions aren't mistakes, Arthur whispered, his finger tracing the pattern of transactions that led from his business accounts to shell companies he'd never authorized. Each paper revealed another layer of Evelyn's deception: fabricated expenditures, inflated administrative costs, and, most damning of all, a series of offshore accounts that matched perfectly with Evelyn's personal travel schedule. Arthur had started investigating after noticing discrepancies in the quarterly reports. What began as minor curiosity had unraveled into a shocking revelation. Over the past 3 years, Evelyn had systematically embezzled nearly $7 million from his companies while positioning herself as his financial protector. The manipulation went beyond mere theft. Buried in the paperwork was evidence that Evelyn had been deliberately isolating Arthur from his former colleagues and friends. Emails showed she had canceled meetings without his knowledge, turned away visitors claiming he was too fragile, and even intercepted personal correspondence that might have broken through his shell of bitterness. When Chloe entered the study with afternoon tea, she found Arthur surrounded by stacks of financial documents, his face set in grim determination. "I've been a fool," he said without looking up. "All this time, I believed my isolation was the world's response to my condition, but it was engineered, meticulously planned by someone I trusted with everything." "Evelyn?" Chloe asked, though she already knew the answer. Arthur nodded, handing her a folder containing the most damning evidence. "She's been siphoning funds through a network of false companies. But worse than the money is how she manipulated my perception of reality. Those threats you received weren't random. They were calculated to remove anyone who might help me see the truth." Chloe skimmed the documents, her eyes widening. "This shows a clear pattern of financial abuse. She's been exploiting her position of trust. The question is what to do about it," Arthur said, straightening his posture. "I've contacted my attorney. Evelyn will be here in an hour, thinking it's a routine financial meeting." The confrontation came with the afternoon storm. Thunder rattled the windows as Evelyn strode into Arthur's study, her confident smile faltering when she saw the spread of documents and the cold determination in Arthur's eyes. "We need to discuss some financial irregularities," Arthur began, his voice steady. Evelyn's training kicked in immediately. "Arthur, darling, you know how these reports can be confusing. Let me explain the—" "Stop." The word cut through the room like a blade. "I've had forensic accountants review everything. The shell companies, the diverted assets, the falsified documents, all of it leads back to you." Evelyn's face hardened, but she maintained her composure. "You're confused, Arthur. Your accident affected more than your body. Your mind isn't what it used to be. These wild accusations are supported by evidence," Arthur finished, sliding a folder across the desk. 3 years of systematic theft, 3 years of isolating me from anyone who might notice. 3 years of convincing me I was helpless without you. As Evelyn flipped through the papers, her denial transformed into something darker. Do you really think anyone will believe you? Look at you, a broken man in a wheelchair who can barely dress himself. Who's more credible, you or the woman who's dedicated her life to managing your affairs? The psychological manipulation was textbook, targeting Arthur's vulnerability and creating doubt. But something had changed in Arthur. The garden visits, Lucas's innocent wisdom, and Chloe's steady support had strengthened him beyond what Evelyn could see. That might have worked before, Arthur replied calmly, but you made a critical error. You assumed my physical limitations made me incapable of fighting back. The door opened, and Arthur's attorney entered with 2 police officers. The color drained from Evelyn's face as she realized the meeting had been a setup. "This is absurd," she hissed, turning to Chloe, who stood quietly by the bookshelf. "This is your doing. You've poisoned him against me." Chloe remained silent, but Arthur spoke up. "She did nothing except show me respect and dignity. That contrast helped me see what you've been doing all along." Evelyn's desperation turned dangerous as she switched tactics. "Arthur, think about this. Everything I did was for your own good. You weren't capable of handling these decisions after your accident. I protected you. By stealing millions," Arthur's voice was steel, "by isolating me from everyone who cared about me, by threatening my staff." As the evidence mounted, Evelyn made her final play. "I've already spoken with your medical team. They have serious concerns about your mental capacity to make financial decisions. The courts will side with me. They always favor the caretaker in these situations." This was the manipulative tactic Arthur had anticipated. That might be true in some cases, but not when the caretaker has a documented history of financial exploitation, not when there's clear evidence of embezzlement. The attorney stepped forward. "Ms. Hartley, we have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges of financial elder abuse and fraud. However, Mr. Foster is willing to avoid pressing charges if you sign a full confession, return all misappropriated funds, and agree to never contact him again." For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows. Then Evelyn's facade cracked completely. "You ungrateful wretch," she spat at Arthur. "I gave you everything. Without me, you'd still be rotting in that hospital bed, forgotten by everyone." Arthur remained unnervingly calm. "No, Evelyn, you took everything. My money, my confidence, my connections to the outside world. But that ends today." As the police officers moved closer, Evelyn's survival instincts took over. She signed the confession with shaking hands, her perfect manicure now chipped and uneven from nervously picking at her nails throughout the confrontation. "This isn't over," she warned, as she was escorted from the room. "You need me. You'll see." Arthur watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of loss and liberation. "I already see clearly for the first time in years." After Evelyn's departure, the mansion seemed to exhale. Arthur wheeled himself to the window, watching as Evelyn's car disappeared down the long driveway. "Are you all right?" Chloe asked, joining him. "I should have seen it sooner," he admitted. The signs were there, the isolation, the dependency she created, how she positioned herself as indispensable while systematically dismantling my life. "Manipulative people are skilled at making their victims feel trapped," Chloe observed. "Breaking free requires recognizing their tactics and building support networks to counter them." Arthur turned to her, a new resolve in his eyes. "I've spent years believing I'd lost control of my life when the accident took my mobility, but today proved the opposite. I can still stand up for myself, even if I can't stand on my own legs." Later that evening, Arthur asked Chloe to join him in the garden. The air felt lighter somehow, as if Evelyn's departure had changed the atmosphere of the entire estate. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Arthur said, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "With Evelyn gone, there's going to be a lot to rebuild. Not just the financial mess, but my connections to the world." Chloe smiled. "One step at a time. That's how recovery works, right?" "Speaking of steps," Arthur replied with newfound determination, "I've decided to restart my physical therapy, not because I expect miracles, but because I'm ready to try again. Would you be willing to help with that too?" "Of course," Chloe answered without hesitation. Arthur's decision to restart therapy seemed simple, but beneath the surface lurked a question that terrified him more than any physical challenge. What if failure wasn't his body's fault, but his will's? The rehabilitation room gleamed with polished equipment, parallel bars, stability balls, and resistance bands arranged in neat rows. 3 days after Evelyn's dramatic departure, Arthur had made a decision that surprised even Chloe. "I want to try again," he'd said with quiet determination over breakfast. "The therapy. Call Dr. Harrison and schedule sessions." When Chloe first helped Arthur into the mansion's private rehabilitation room, the air felt charged with possibility. The space had been untouched for months, a shrine to abandoned hope. Now, as they entered for their 3rd session, something had shifted. Arthur's eyes no longer darted away from the equipment that once represented his failures. "Let's push harder today," Arthur said, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Not a request, a declaration. The physical therapist, Dr. Harrison, exchanged a concerned glance with Chloe. "Arthur, we should maintain our current pace," the doctor cautioned. "Recovery isn't just about willpower. Your body needs—" "My body is rested enough," Arthur interrupted, his voice steady but firm. 3 years of rest. I want to stand today." Dr. Harrison sighed. "That's not how rehabilitation works. Your muscles have atrophied significantly, and the nerve damage—" "I didn't ask for a medical lecture," Arthur said, a flash of his old sharpness returning. "I asked to stand." The tension in the room thickened as Dr. Harrison reluctantly adjusted the plan. He positioned the parallel bars and nodded to Chloe, who wheeled Arthur into position. What happened next transcended mere physical therapy. As Arthur gripped the bars, his knuckles whitening with effort, Chloe noticed something she'd never seen before: vulnerability mixed with raw determination. The man who had hidden behind walls of bitterness was exposing his greatest fear, that he might try with everything he had and still fail. The rehabilitation process isn't just about strengthening muscles, Dr. Harrison explained as he positioned himself behind Arthur. It's a holistic approach that addresses psychological barriers too. Arthur's face contorted with effort as he pushed against the bars, attempting to lift himself. The first attempt ended with him slumping back into the chair, frustration emanating from every pore. "Again," he commanded, more to himself than anyone else. Chloe moved closer, her presence steady and encouraging. "You're doing great, Arthur." Her voice carried no pity, only confidence. Arthur shot her a look, not anger, but something more complex. "Don't placate me," he said, his breathing heavy. "I'm not there yet." "I'm not placating you," Chloe replied with unexpected firmness. "I'm acknowledging your effort." "There's a difference." Something in her tone reached him. Arthur nodded, then gripped the bars again. This time, as he pushed upward, his arms trembled violently, but his body began to rise. Inch by agonizing inch, Arthur Foster lifted himself from the wheelchair that had defined his existence for 3 years. For 5 seconds, he stood, unsteady, shaking, but upright, before collapsing back. But those 5 seconds changed everything. The look on his face wasn't triumph, it was revelation. "We need to build up your core strength," Dr. Harrison said, professional mask slipping to reveal genuine excitement. "Your upper body strength is impressive, but your stabilizing muscles—" "It was enough," Arthur interrupted, but without his usual sharpness. His voice had softened. For today, it was enough. Chloe realized she was crying only when Arthur looked at her with surprise. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "Because you stood," she answered simply. "You did it." Arthur's expression shifted, and he reached for her hand, a gesture so unexpected that Chloe nearly stepped back. "No," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "We did it. I wouldn't have tried again without you." The acknowledgement wasn't just about physical assistance. In that moment, both recognized how their relationship had transcended the professional boundaries. Arthur's gratitude wasn't just for a caregiver's help, but for something deeper, for the emotional support that had reignited his belief in possibility. Supportive relationships can significantly enhance determination during rehabilitation, Dr. Harrison noted, as he observed their interaction. The psychological component of recovery is just as crucial as the physical exercises. The next day, Arthur asked Chloe to join him in the study. The room had been transformed since Lucas's visit. the drawing now framed prominently on the wall, a splash of childlike color against the mahogany paneling. "I have something to discuss with you," Arthur began, his tone unreadable. "Your position here." Chloe felt a flutter of anxiety. Had she crossed a line? Been too familiar? "I'd like to offer you a permanent role," he continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "Not just as my caregiver, but as my household manager. The salary is outlined on the 3rd page." When Chloe opened the folder, the figure made her gasp. It was more than triple her current salary. Enough to move Lucas to a better school, to save for his college, to never count pennies for bus fare again. "This is," she began, struggling to find words. "Appropriate compensation for what you've brought to this house," Arthur finished. His eyes, once cold and analytical, now held warmth. "You've changed things here, Chloe. Not just for me." The conversation shifted to Lucas, and Arthur's expression softened further. "I'd like Lucas to visit more often," he said carefully. "If that's acceptable to you. This place, it's too empty." The mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum was evolving. Arthur's recovery mirrored in the gradual transformation of his surroundings. The next weekend, Lucas arrived with his backpack stuffed with drawings. Arthur had prepared a surprise, a professional-grade art kit arranged in the sunroom, which had been converted into an impromptu studio. "Is this really for me?" Lucas asked, eyes wide as he surveyed the collection of colored pencils, markers, and sketching tools. "Every artist needs proper materials," Arthur replied simply, watching as the boy examined each item with reverence. In the weeks that followed, Arthur's physical progress accelerated. The standing became more stable, longer in duration. But the real transformation wasn't measured in seconds upright or steps taken. It was in the moments between therapy sessions. It was Arthur joining Chloe and Lucas for dinner, instead of eating alone in his room. It was Arthur laughing, actually laughing, when Lucas explained why fish make better friends than cats. "They remember you for months, even years, and they never scratch your furniture." It was Arthur rolling his wheelchair into the garden each morning, not because Chloe suggested it, but because he wanted to. 1 month after that first successful standing attempt, Dr. Harrison positioned Arthur between the parallel bars again. This time, when Arthur pushed himself upright, his body didn't shake as violently. His breathing remained steady, controlled. "Now," Dr. Harrison said, "try to shift your weight to your right leg." Arthur complied, his face a mask of concentration. "Good. Now the left foot forward. Just an inch." The room fell silent as Arthur stared down at his left foot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with excruciating slowness, his foot slid forward. Just barely. Hardly even a full step, but deliberate movement nonetheless. When Arthur looked up, his eyes locked with Chloe's. No words were needed. This victory belonged to both of them, a testament to the power of belief as much as physical healing. That evening, Arthur asked Chloe to join him in the garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the paths he had designed years earlier, bathing everything in golden light. "I'd like to thank you," he said, as they sat beside the koi pond. "Not just for your professional care, but for something more valuable." "What's that?" Chloe asked. Arthur considered his words carefully. "For seeing me as a person, not a condition. For bringing your son into my life, when I'd forgotten what uncomplicated joy looks like. For," he paused, searching for the right words, "for creating a sense of family where there was none." That word, family, hung in the air like the golden sunlight, seemingly innocent, yet charged with possibilities neither dared acknowledge. While Chloe smiled warmly at Arthur's gratitude, neither could have predicted how quickly the mansion's transformation from mausoleum to home would accelerate, or the stunning question Arthur would soon ask that would change everything. 3 months after Arthur's first successful step in therapy, the mansion's garden burst with new life. Spring had arrived in full force, mirroring the remarkable transformation happening within its walls. Garden tables draped in cream-colored linens dotted the lawn, while staff moved efficiently among guests carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. This wasn't merely a casual gathering, it was a celebration of milestones that once seemed impossible. Dr. Harrison stood chatting with Lucy near the koi pond, occasionally glancing with pride toward Arthur, who navigated between guests with the assistance of a sleek black cane. His progress had exceeded medical expectations, though the journey had been grueling. Each morning began with intensive therapy sessions that left him exhausted but determined. The physical pain seemed secondary to his newfound purpose. Lucas darted between guests in a crisp button-down shirt, proudly showing off the professional-grade sketchbook Arthur had given him. The boy had become a fixture in the mansion, his laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence for years. Though only 6, he'd assumed the unofficial role of Arthur's most enthusiastic supporter, often sitting beside him during therapy sessions with encouraging words that somehow carried more weight than the professionals. Chloe watched this scene unfold from the edge of the garden, her heart swelling. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing extravagant, but worlds away from the desperate young woman who had first stepped through the mansion gates. Her responsibilities had evolved beyond caregiving into something more comprehensive, managing household affairs while continuing to provide emotional support that Arthur had come to rely upon. Quite different from when you first arrived, isn't it? Lucy appeared beside her, offering a glass of champagne. Chloe accepted with a smile. Sometimes I can hardly believe it's the same place. She paused, watching Arthur laughing, with an old colleague who had returned to his life, or the same man. The transformation extended beyond Arthur's physical recovery. The mansion itself had shed its museum-like atmosphere. Rooms once shrouded in darkness now welcomed sunlight through open curtains. Spaces, previously unused, now hosted game nights where Lucas taught Arthur chess, or quiet evenings where they discussed architectural designs and crayon masterpieces with equal seriousness. Arthur raised his glass, calling for attention. The garden fell silent as guests turned toward him. He stood straight, his cane planted firmly beside him, exuding a confidence that had once seemed permanently lost. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice strong. "3 months ago, I couldn't stand on my own. Today, I walked across this garden to greet each of you." Appreciative applause rippled through the crowd. But this celebration isn't about my legs. It's about something far more significant. It's about reclaiming purpose when you believe it's lost forever. His gaze found Chloe across the garden. "None of this would have been possible without the right people believing in possibilities when I couldn't see them myself." Conversations resumed as Arthur made his way deliberately toward Chloe. Each step represented countless hours of determination, sweat, and pain, a physical manifestation of his internal journey from isolation to connection. "You look beautiful," he said quietly when he reached her. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, noticing how his tailored suit accentuated his recovering physique. "Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." They moved together toward the far corner of the garden, where a stone bench overlooked a newly planted rose garden. Arthur had specially designed this space during his recovery, sketching plans from his wheelchair before he could stand to see them implemented. "Do you remember the first time we came out here?" he asked. "Of course. You hadn't been in the garden for 3 years. I was terrified," he admitted. "Not of being outside, but of feeling hope again. Hope is dangerous when you've convinced yourself that your life is effectively over." They reached the bench, and Arthur gestured for her to sit. Instead of joining her, he remained standing, his expression suddenly serious. "Chloe, when you first arrived, I was a bitter man, imprisoned not just by my condition, but by my own walls. I believed family was something I'd lost my chance at." The evening light cast long shadows across the garden as guests discreetly began to gather at a distance, sensing a significant moment unfolding. With deliberate movements, Arthur lowered himself to one knee, balancing carefully with his cane. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. "What are you doing?" Chloe whispered, her eyes widening. "Your therapy. You shouldn't." "Some things are worth the effort," he replied, reaching for her hand. "The ethical considerations of this moment haven't escaped me. I know our relationship began as employer and employee, but what we've built goes beyond professional boundaries. We've created something that resembles what I think real families should be: supportive, challenging, honest." Her heart raced as he continued. "The bond between us transcends traditional relationships. You've witnessed my vulnerabilities when I was at my lowest, and Instead of pitying me, you showed me how to find strength again." From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "I'm not asking you to be my caregiver anymore. I'm asking if you'll build a life with me. Will you marry me, Chloe?" Time seemed suspended as the question hung between them. Chloe's mind flashed to their journey, from the cold interview to bathing a stranger, from threatening notes to triumphant steps. The emotional scars they both carried had somehow healed better together than apart. Tears spilled onto her cheeks as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her reach. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Yes." Lucas broke from the crowd, racing toward them with unbridled enthusiasm. "Does this mean we're really going to be a family?" he asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Arthur pulled the boy into an embrace that included Chloe. "We already are," he answered, the certainty in his voice leaving no room for doubt. 6 weeks later, the garden transformed again, this time with rows of white chairs and an archway of climbing roses. Arthur stood without assistance at the altar, having dedicated additional therapy hours to fulfill his determination to stand throughout the ceremony. When Chloe appeared at the garden entrance, in a simple white dress, Lucas proudly walking beside her as ring-bearer, Arthur's composure momentarily faltered. This woman who had entered his life out of financial desperation had become the cornerstone of his rebuilt world. Their vows were intimate and honest, acknowledging the unconventional path that led them to each other. Arthur spoke of finding light in darkness, while Chloe talked about discovering strength in vulnerability. Lucas added his own impromptu promise to draw pictures of us forever, bringing laughter through happy tears. As Arthur slipped the ring onto her finger, he quoted words from his first architectural manifesto. "The strongest structures aren't those that never crack, but those designed to bend without breaking." The celebration continued well into the evening, the mansion's windows glowing with warmth that spilled onto the lawn. Where silence once dominated, music and laughter now flowed freely. Former colleagues reconnected with Arthur, discovering a man more authentic and approachable than the success they'd known before. Life truly unfolds in the most unexpected ways. When Chloe first stepped through those iron gates, desperate for a paycheck to feed her son, she couldn't have imagined the transformation awaiting both her and Arthur. Their story reminds us that rock bottom isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's the foundation for something beautiful. As Arthur himself reflected, there's still beauty even when everything seems lost. His words capture the essence of their journey together. When he first sat coldly in that wheelchair, no one could have predicted how profoundly one determined young mother would change his life. Their story isn't just about romance. It's about finding hope in unexpected places. Two broken people, each carrying their own wounds, discovered that healing doesn't happen in isolation. Sometimes the family we create becomes more meaningful than the circumstances we're born into, proving that with enough courage to remain open, life's greatest challenges can lead to our most profound blessings.